We need to get a new head of the World Bank, for God's sake. This is ridiculous to have a climate denier as the head of the World Bank. Since almost 90% of the increased emissions going forward are coming from developing countries, we have to take the top layers of risk off the access to capital in these developing countries. That's the job of the World Bank, to coordinate the other multilateral development banks, and they're simply not doing it. We need to get rid of that leadership, put new leadership in.
Trillions of dollars.
The president of the World Bank faces mounting pressure to resign amid accusations of climate change denial as members of Congress call for his immediate removal from office. Hello and welcome to Inside America. I'm Ghida Fakhry. The World Bank will hold its annual meetings in Washington next week amid a growing controversy surrounding its president, David Malpass, appointed by President Trump in 2019 and with 1.5 years left in his term. The controversy was triggered at an event in New York a couple of weeks ago.
Do you accept the scientific consensus that the man-made burning of fossil fuels is rapidly and dangerously warming the planet?
I don't know if everyone wants to comment on that. What we are doing is having impactful projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We have a mission of a World Bank that's powerful.
Will you answer the question? Is that...
I don't even know. I'm not a scientist.
That answer led to calls for his resignation. 27 Democratic lawmakers have signed a letter addressed to President Biden in which they criticize Malpass for being, quote, brazenly ignorant about the impacts of climate change, and write, his recent statements about climate change are troubling and we urge you to advocate for the removal or forced resignation of David Malpass as World Bank Group president. The facts are clear that we are in a climate crisis and there's no alternative but to take bold action. In a rare move, the White House also added its voice to the growing criticism.
So we disagree with the comments made by President Malpass. We expect the World Bank to be a global leader of climate ambition and mobilization as well, of significantly more climate finance for developing countries, as is the business of the World Bank.
In an attempt to counter the mounting pressures, Malpass tried to get back on message by saying, quote, it's clear that greenhouse gas emissions from human activity are causing climate change. So will it be enough, or will the Biden administration push for Malpass's removal, as environmental groups, some European capitals, and prominent figures within the administration have been reportedly urging ahead of the World Bank's meetings in Washington next week? Joining me now to discuss all this is Mark Hertsgaard, Executive Director of Covering Climate Now. He's also Environment Correspondent for The Nation. Mark Hertsgaard, it is a long-standing tradition that the government of the United States selects the president of the World Bank and never criticizes them, at least not publicly. What prompted the Biden administration to go after Malpass and even for some members of Congress to demand his resignation?
Their key objection is that David Malpass, who of course was appointed, or I should say selected by former President Donald Trump, is that David Malpass has been a denier of climate science and has had, therefore, a very poor record at the World Bank as president of the World Bank in relation to climate change, which, of course, is one of the major responsibilities of the bank. The bank is the largest source of public funding of development in poor countries around the world. And as we see, most recently in Pakistan, many poor countries around the world are suffering grievously from the climate crisis. And this is why you had former Vice President Al Gore say on stage that, for God's sake, it's ridiculous to have a climate denier running the World Bank at this time of climate emergency.
Yet it is highly unusual, though, isn't it? Unprecedented for any White House to criticize an American president of the World Bank. John Kerry, the special presidential envoy for climate, seems to back Al Gore's call to get rid of Malpass. In fact, you were at the Climate Week event where both of them, in addition to Malpass, spoke in separate sessions. When you asked John Kerry if the administration still had faith in the president of the World Bank, what did he say? How much did he waver?
Yeah, I asked former Senator Kerry that question after Gore had called for Malpass to go, and after Malpass had appeared on the stage and said, "I find that very odd," but Malpass 3 times dodged direct questions about whether he accepted the formal climate science. So I reminded Mr. Kerry that what had happened, and then I asked him very directly, does the Biden administration have confidence in David Malpass as president of the World Bank? And Kerry's answer was very interesting. He at first said, well, it's not my role to say that, that's the president's role, and I'm not going to speak about any individual. Now, normally, if a politician doesn't want to answer a question, that's where they stop. But Kerry went on to say, I will tell you this, though. And then essentially he said that they are working behind the scenes to push him out. What he specifically said was, I, John Kerry, have been working inside of the administration along with many others, pushing on a door, an open door, not a closed door, to get major structural reforms at the World Bank.
And that is so telling, Mark, isn't it? Because he admitted that he's been pushing for months for a change at the helm of the bank, and that, as you say, it's an open door. It isn't a shut door. Is the administration, though, actively working behind the scenes to remove Malpass, or was this all a storm in a teacup?
Well, I don't think it's a storm in a teacup. It is, as you mentioned, very unusual for public officials, U.S. government officials, to say this publicly. He even invoked the name of Janet Yellen. He said, Janet Yellen has been calling for this reform. We are pushing inside the administration for this. He said some of the international multilateral development banks are doing better on climate, and he specifically mentioned the Asian Development Bank doing better, African Development Bank doing better, European doing better. And then he said, and I'll stop there because I think you can see where I'm going. And the crowd sort of laughed. And then the New York Times reporter on stage, Lisa Friedman, to her credit, followed up on my question because she's sitting there right across from Kerry. And she repeated my question, said, but sir, does the Biden administration have confidence in Malpass? And that's when Kerry went on to say that we are talking right now with other governments, with our friends, with the Germans, with the Europeans, with the French, right now at the meetings in New York during Climate Week, and we are going to get action on this. So that is as close as any politician will ever come to saying, this is what we're doing behind the scenes. So no, this is not a tempest in a teapot. And I suspect that this story is going to keep developing between now and the meetings upcoming. And especially, I wouldn't be surprised if there's some movement on this by the time of the COP27 climate summit in Egypt in early November.
And it does sound like a coordinated campaign to oust Malpass, even though, after all, he has been president of the World Bank for almost 2 years during the Biden administration. But as you say, even the Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, went after him, and there are rumors that she may or may not attend the board meetings next week. It looks like it is coordinated, but one could also argue that it could backfire whether or not Malpass resigns. Let's be honest, does it really matter much if the president of the World Bank ultimately follows the will of the shareholders? As he argues, that's what he has done. It's Congress that funds U.S. contributions to the bank, and it is the Treasury Department that oversees U.S. participation.
It is very true that the president of the United States cannot fire the president of the World Bank. There is a board of governors at the bank, but it works like a private bank in the sense that the shareholders control it. The United States is the biggest shareholder, which, by the way, John Kerry also pointed out in answer to our questions last week. And he said that they are working with the other big shareholders. Now, the way it would work is that you have another meeting and a decision by the governing board, and they can easily, it's totally within their authority to vote David Malpass out. Does that matter? It absolutely matters to countries around the world who are in the grips of the climate emergency. And it matters to all of us because we need all of the world's countries to get off of fossil fuels immediately, as fast as possible, if we're going to rein in the climate emergency. And that means that you've got to have loans going into countries like Nigeria, like Pakistan, like Vietnam, that enable them to shift away from oil, coal, and gas and onto cleaner energy sources. And Al Gore was pointing out on stage Right now, if you want to do that and you're an entrepreneur, say in Nigeria, it costs you 7 times more in interest charges than it would cost an entrepreneur in, say, Britain or the United States to get these solar installations built. That's the role of the World Bank, and the World Bank has to come in with that money. So if you've got a climate denier at the head of the World Bank, that's not going to happen.
Sure, you could argue his words carry a lot of weight, and of course they do as head of the World Bank. But as you say, the bank itself has so much on its plate, so many issues and challenges to deal with. At the end of the day, has this controversy created a real crisis within the bank? Has the White House ultimately miscalculated?
I don't think so. The real crisis is the climate crisis. And the bank is charged with dealing with poverty around the world. That's its number one mission. And you're not going to be able to fix poverty around the world if the climate crisis keeps pummeling these countries. Pakistan, 1/3 of Pakistan put underwater by floods. You know, this is happening to all countries, terrible drought and famine in the Horn of Africa. They absolutely need, the bank needs to be fighting poverty and climate change at the same time.
All right, we'll have to wait and see. Mark Hertsgaard, good to have you on the program. Thanks very much.
Thank you for having me.
Trust is also not created when countries pledge, as I said yesterday, $100 billion per annum for climate finance and then deliver a fraction to developing countries. Or when the same countries commit to 0.7% of GDP as of ODA, development assistance, but we don't see it nor get it. Or when the countries that stop others from exploiting newfound fossil fuels are historically the world's largest producers and polluters.
The US is one of the leading CO2 emitters. It is also the largest shareholder at the World Bank, which announced last month a record $31.7 billion in fiscal year 2022 to help countries address the impact of climate change. The bank, which touts itself as the largest multilateral financier of climate action in developing countries, says this amounts to an almost 20% increase from the previous year's spending on climate action. But is this accurate? And is the World Bank doing enough to provide climate finance to developing countries to help them transition to renewable energy and mitigate the impacts of the climate crisis? A report published by Oxfam this week has cast doubt over the World Bank's reported climate spending. The latest findings suggest that up to 40% of the bank's stated climate-related funding cannot be accounted for. There are growing calls for fundamental structural reforms within the institution to better address the changing geopolitical landscape and financial needs of developing countries. The bank is largely controlled by its biggest donors, with the US accounting for the largest voting share, followed by Japan and China. So is this likely to change anytime soon? Joining me now to discuss the crisis facing the World Bank's leadership and calls for its reform is Daniel Runde, Senior Vice President and Chair in Global Analysis at CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a bipartisan research organization in Washington, D.C. Daniel Runde, it is unprecedented for the White House and for members of Congress to criticize so openly and forcefully a president of the World Bank, isn't it? What's behind these attacks?
It's very unfortunate. David Malpass is doing a great job at the World Bank Group. The World Bank Group is a very important institution. My view is that there were a series of environmental activists, folks pretty much on the far left side of the spectrum, who said a series of irresponsible things. David Malpass made a minor gaffe at a conference a couple of weeks ago. It was blown out of proportion. He corrected the record, and then he said he wasn't going to resign. I put out a piece saying they ought to leave David Malpass alone, because I think he's doing an excellent job, and the agenda in front of the World Bank is enormous, and we need able, strong leadership. And rather, the Biden administration ought to go out of their way to, now that they've made some veiled criticisms of him, I think they ought to cut it out and now fully support him, because he's got at least almost 2 years left or 18 months left on his current contract. And let's make sure that he finishes his first term strong.
Hold on, though. You say that he's done a good job. You say his comments were blown out of proportion. You've even suggested that they were used as a political weapon to try to remove him. Whether this is politically motivated or not, the fact is that the president of the World Bank didn't help himself, did he, by saying that he didn't know if the burning of fossil fuels caused climate change. It wasn't an off-the-cuff remark. He was asked repeatedly before coming up with this answer. He tried to correct himself afterwards, as you say, but the damage was already done.
He corrected the record afterwards. I also think we have to look at not only what he has said, which he corrected, but we have to look at the record of the World Bank Group. They've made major commitments on climate and the environment. If you look at what they're saying in terms of the tens of billions of dollars, arguably the World Bank Group is the largest financier of climate finance in the world. And if you look under his watch since 2019, he's approved a series of strategies that move in that direction. I think that's been with the approval of the Biden administration and all the other shareholders. It's a multilateral institution, and his strategy, which reflects the will and the interests of other shareholders, speaks to the fact that the World Bank Group is the largest financier of climate finance, and that has been on his watch.
Sure,
so
but that is the World Bank Group. But isn't it problematic, though, to hear the president of the World Bank make this type of statement, not just for the United States, but for many countries around the world, unless you're a climate change denier? The president of the World Bank has a lot of authority. He isn't powerless.
He's not a climate change denier. He has said that he recognizes that there is climate changing. He's rectified his statement. And so I think we should take him at his word. President Biden makes all sorts of gaffes and missteps, and we give him a pass. And when they're corrected by his staff, President Malpass has come forward, has rectified a statement or a gaffe, and has fixed it. I think the story's largely over in the US press. It's not getting a lot of coverage any further. Some of it may have been because of the article that I put out in Fox Business on this.
The larger question, as you say, is about what the World Bank can and has been doing. It's not just whether Malpass resigns or is pushed out. He might very well finish his remaining 1.5 years in office. The issue that has been on the table for some years now is the tradition that the president of the World Bank is an American and the head of the IMF is a European. A lot of people are calling for fundamental reform. The world, they say, has changed. The economy of the world has changed as well, and that arrangement is being challenged by the South and by emerging economies. Has the time come to simply have the most suitable candidate head these two organizations, whatever their citizenship may be?
I think it's an excellent question, Ghida. I take perhaps a contrarian view, which is that there's what I would describe, and I've written a paper about this, called the global spoils system. There's a logic to how some of these top leaderships posts are given out. I've written a new book that's coming out in January called The American Imperative: Reclaiming Global Leadership Through Soft Power. And I talk about the importance of American leadership and sustained American leadership in multilateral institutions. So my view is that at the time of the Bretton Woods conference in the 1940s, the United States was going to lead both institutions, both the IMF and the World Bank. For an unfortunate series of events in the 1940s, we had a person who was a Soviet spy in the US government who betrayed the United States. We knew this, and he wanted to become head of the IMF. We didn't want him to know that we knew he was spying on the United States, so he did not become the head of the IMF. Instead, the first head of the IMF was a Belgian. This is in a book called The Battle of Bretton Woods by a Council on Foreign Relations expert on the multilateral institutions.
But it's still always a European who heads the IMF. And we saw the scandal that engulfed Dominique Strauss-Kahn. We also saw the scandal that engulfed Paul Wolfowitz at the World Bank when he had to resign. Would the world be better served if the head of these organizations weren't beholden to the great powers?
So I think it's a legitimate question. I think we have to go and look at a whole series of slots. For example, the United States has never been the head of the Secretary Generalship of the United Nations. So I think we'd have to put several big slots on the table and make some trades. The Europeans have been unwilling to let go of the IMF. My view is both the IMF and the World Bank are seen as twin institutions.
But why should there be those conditions, though? Why shouldn't it be fair and democratic and allow every other country to have a fair say in how these organizations are run?
I think it's an interesting question. I think that we have 200 multilateral institutions. About 30 of them I would describe are sort of the commanding heights of the multilateral system. I don't think it's in the US interest, for example, for someone from the Chinese Communist Party to run the World Bank or the IMF, even if they were very qualified, because I think our interests would be put at risk. I don't
Why
think
not?
it would
Again, it's not just about the interests of the United States, isn't it? I mean, you've got dozens and dozens of member states.
Ghida, I think that's totally fair, but I also think at the same time, if we are paying the condo fees of global leadership, if we're funding a lot of this work, I think we often get a larger seat at the table for these institutions. And so in my book, The American Imperative, Reclaiming Global Leadership Through Soft Power, my argument is that we cannot ignore the multilateral institutions. Rather, the United States needs to remain engaged and lead. So in my mind,
but again, by leading, if you mean the US needs to retain its de facto veto, is that the way forward? Because linked to this is the shareholder structure. The leadership cannot be changed unless the power structure, the voting rights of each member state, is reconsidered. Should the shareholders format be reconsidered?
My view is that we set up these institutions to help be a force multiplier for the liberal international order set up after World War II. I know that's a lot of word salad, but it basically means there's a Western form of globalization on offer, and there's a new form of globalization being set forward by the Chinese Communist Party. You've had a series of institutions set up, such as the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. They've already put forward having a president who happens to be from mainland China. My view is I think this is a legitimate question for you to also ask the head of the AIIB if the Chinese are willing to step down from being the head of the AIIB. And I'm going to bet you the answer.
Again, forgive me to interrupt you. This doesn't take into account the changing economic and political landscape. Going back to 1945, at the time, the Western nations accounted perhaps for 80% of global GDP. Now it's 40% or less. I mean, times have changed. Shouldn't these organizations change as well in their structures?
So I think we should be open. Over time, we've done a series of incremental shifts in terms of the allocation of shares. My view is that the World Bank presidency should remain in the hands of the United States if and until we have a larger conversation about whether or not the United States can run the Secretary General of the United Nations, whether or not the United States could run the IMF. I also think there's a series of other important institutions that go to various regional leaders. The Asian Development Bank historically has gone to a Japanese finance person. No one ever complains about that. There's always been a switch between an Anglophone or a Francophone African leader at the African Development Bank. We're the largest outside shareholder of the African Development Bank. Would the United States be able to be the head of the African Development Bank at some point if there was the most qualified person? I think there'd be a lot of resistance to that.
But again, this is all about perpetuating American and Western hegemony, isn't it? Because over the years, the share of the US has declined, but the US retains a blocking majority at the World Bank.
I strongly prefer, I believe that the system that was set up after World War II and the peace, the large non-great power wars that have happened since then is one of the greatest things that's ever happened. All the global development, all the prosperity is undergirded by a large sense of peace and stability that's been undergirded by these institutions. The United States has provided significant leadership via these institutions. We have provided the condo fees of global leadership. If you want to be a leader, you got to pay the condo fees of global leadership.
All right. Daniel Runde, thanks very much for being on the program. Really appreciate it. Washington still believes the leadership of the World Bank, a large and powerful lending institution established in the aftermath of World War II to help with the reconstruction of war-torn Europe, should remain under firm US control, even though its relative shareholdings have dropped from 35% of the bank's capital when it was established to around 20%. Today, the bank remains under tight Western control, even if their share of global GDP went from 80% in 1945 to less than 40% today. Despite the mounting pressures from other member states, the voting structures of both the World Bank and the IMF, for that matter, are unlikely to change as the US maintains de facto veto power. But something is happening. Back in April, US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen called for reforms of the bank to address, quote, challenges that will now require investment on a scale that an international institution can't manage on its own, like climate change. Bretton Woods institutions have become anachronistic on many levels. It's plain to see. When World Bank President David Malpass was publicly admonished by the White House for his "I don't know" answer, when asked if he accepted that fossil fuels caused climate change, it rocked the bank. And so, in short, although the move to replace Malpass may be losing some steam amid global tensions that are testing the post-World War II international architecture and impacting financial markets, something does seem afoot. But for the White House to stir the pot at the helm of the World Bank now seems bizarre. That the bank needs a reset, as it puts it, is hardly a discovery. That the president of the bank is nominated by the largest and veto-yielding shareholder, the United States, a remnant of another era. So yes, a reset at the World Bank may indeed be long overdue. That's all from me, Ghida, Fakhry, and the team. Thanks for watching.